right, welcome back. My name is Tim Green. To my right is our Union soldier. This is Mr. Rob. To my left is our Confederate soldier, and this is Sebastian. And today we're going to talk about food that was issued to Civil War soldiers and maybe some things that they would supplement that with. For Union and Confederate soldiers, we always notice the differences between the two of them. You know, each one of them is dressed a little different. They might act a little different and fight a little different, but for the most part, things were very similar between them. And that goes for their food as well. You know, when the Confederate government was started, the easiest way for them to get things going was to use Union Army regulations as a standard for what they did. So their rations that they were supposed to get were very similar between the two. But as you'll see as we talk, there were some differences that came in, especially as supplies became an issue. Now both of them are wearing haversacks and canteens, so that is going to be a similarity between the two of them. The haversack is used to carry their food and their plate and utensils in, so that's going to keep them going for eating, and then their canteen is what they use to carry their water in. Now you can see Sebastian here has just a plain fabric canvas haversack. It's going to do what he needs to do, but Mr. Rob here has one that has been waterproofed, and this is a little nicer to be able to protect things that are inside of it. And you can also see that inside there's another bag, and that helps to keep everything separate and to protect what he's got in there as well. So let's go ahead and talk about the food that they were issued, the things that they would be carried in their haversack. So Mr. Rob, what would a Union soldier be issued?
For a day, a Union soldier on campaign on the march would be issued 8 or 9 to 10 pieces of hardtack. It's hard bread, and about 3/4 of a pound of pork, salt pork or beef, and that's what we're going to have be issued for one day. We for 3 days march, I'd have about 27 to 30 pieces of hardtack, and that would be 3 pieces of pork that size.
Okay, good. And in addition to that, in camp, what are the types of things that they might give you that you might not carry with you from place to place?
Well, in camp, I'm gonna get fresh vegetables if it's available, but I'm also gonna get dried beans, dry rice, and these things are gonna be what we have to soak and prepare to make stews. And we're also, I forgot to mention, we're always gonna be issued coffee. The Union Army marches on their coffee. We're going to have coffee and the sugar off a sugar block. We're just going to scrape off some sugar and we're going to have that so we can make coffee. Even on the march, we're going to have that. But in camp, if they don't have fresh vegetables, we're going to get desiccated vegetables. The Union soldiers would call it desecrated vegetables. It would be basically what freeze-dried vegetables look like today. It's pressed and all the water is out of them. It's not something I'm going to put on my plate as a side dish. It's something I'm going to use as a starter for stews.
Okay, great. Now for our Confederate soldiers, Sebastian, things are going to be similar. You might have some similar meat and bread rations, maybe the beans and the rice, but what might be different for you?
For the Confederate Army, you would typically have cornmeal, and you would have a day's worth of that. You would have some pork, but we wouldn't be lucky to have some hardtack brought to us. You would have to make your own breads with your cornmeal, and then you'd be issued all of that.
Okay, and so one of the things that Confederate soldiers had a rough time with as well, in addition to not quite having the same food, one of the big things that they really didn't like was that coffee issue again. It got harder and harder throughout the war because of the blockade. Supplies coming into the Confederacy, a lot of that was blocked, and so coffee was one of those things that was really hard to find in the South. So something that he might add to that or replace it with, he might use chicory or sweet potatoes or acorns, things like that to make coffee out of. But of course that's not quite going to be what he wants, but it'll at least help him deal with it a little better.
Oh, Mr. Tim, in the Union, we would also be issued tea if I was not a coffee drinker. When I joined the Army, I probably turned into a coffee drinker. But tea is going to be black tea, and it's going to be issued to us in a block, which we would scrape off. It's not tea bags like we're used to. Not a social tea, but it's a tea. So we also had tea instead of just coffee.
Right. So that's what the Army is going to give these soldiers. It may or may not be as much as they want, especially for our Confederate soldiers. As the war progresses, supplies get harder and harder to find, and eventually they actually cut down the amount that they were supposed to receive in their ration. So a lot of it had to do with supplies. And so because of that reason, or because they don't like what they have quite as much, they might add to that. So what are some ways that you might get extra food?
Well, there's always foraging, and foraging is going out on the local economy. When the Union Army comes to Virginia, we're going to have some friction with the local population, because up north we would pen our chickens, we would pen our hogs, and down here we found out the hard way that wasn't the norm, and we would actually run into some problems with farmers, because we thought that they were free for us to take, and obviously the farmer didn't think that. But foraging, our quartermaster would go out as a company, not as a mess mate with my messmate, but they would negotiate with the local economy for fresh vegetables and or chickens and hogs on the local economy. But the Union Army after '62 gets very good at supplying us with food. The logistics are excellent. In fact, in '64 and '65, with the siege of Petersburg, we have fresh bread being baked daily for us around the city, because we're in camp. We're not moving at that point. And fresh bread is still getting to us hot, almost better than Amazon.
Right. Yep. And that probably doesn't make you very happy to hear how well he's being supplied, especially later in the war. It did get harder and harder. Other ways that they might supplement their ration, they might have local farmers, somebody that would sell things to them as well. Here on the peninsula, one of the common ways that a soldier would add to his ration was to buy from slaves or freed slaves. These men and women would go gather oysters from the rivers, or other seafood, or they would make pies and cakes or other types of foods, and go around to the Union or Confederate armies, depending on which area of the peninsula they were, and sell to them as well. So that was another way to add to their ration. Any other ways you?
The Union Army's got followers, and we'd actually have the modern day equivalent of shopkeepers. We call them sutlers, who would be following us, and they would be selling luxury items like coffee of essence, which is going to be sold by a sutler, and this has got milk, sugar, and it's just basically like an espresso, which we'd add to hot water to make coffee a lot quicker than grinding beans, or roasting our beans and then grinding them. And we'd also get canned oysters and dried milk, not dried milk, but condensed milk, and we get shirts, we get stationery writing materials, stamps, so we could communicate with our loved ones at home.
And some of those sutler stores, actually Confederates came across and were able to capture sometimes, and you can imagine the joy that those soldiers had as they came across the canned oysters and peaches and condensed milk and all those wonderful things.
Canned peaches.
Right. So
they're a favorite.
Yeah. This might be a way that a Confederate soldier would add as well. Either side could do that, but you read a lot more of the Confederates really needed to add to what they have, the things that they might capture like that, especially from sutler stores, would be a fun prize for them to get. So now that they have their food and they're carrying that with them, there's a number of different ways that they might cook that food. So what are some ways you might cook the rations?
Well, first you're going to have, if you're on the march, it's going to be a messmate. You're going to carry part of this material and he'd carry part of the material. But we would use a canteen half, which is very easy. It's an old canteen that we would basically retain half of it, and it would just fit right on the back side of my canteen, so it dovetails in with what I'm carrying, and it's not very heavy. It's a lot easier to carry than a press frying pan or anything else, because it fits in with my gear. I'm also a mucklet, but I wouldn't carry both of these. I'd carry one or the other. My messmate would carry the other one. This is really good for making a stew, and if you fill that up and make a stew with vegetables and a slice of meat, and you throw in a piece of hardtack to give it some body, it's going to give you a nice hearty stew that you can cook up relatively quickly, and you're going to be able to share that with your messmate and be able to get food in and cooked and prepared and eaten. If you're in camp, it's going to be a company mess, and someone else is going to be detailed to prepare that for you. You just go through and get your share when they feed you.
Right. Okay. Now what about this hardtack? This hardtack is it's pretty hard. It's often hard to eat, to even bite into. So what are some ways that you might make that a little easier to? You mentioned soups and stews.
Right. Well, this is hard, and some of the nicknames for it is teeth duller, and it's just, you cannot bite this and chew it. If you were going to do something like that, what you're going to do normally is you're going to soak this in water or in a stew to give it some body, but you want to get the water back into it. So, but the ideal thing with that is to make skilly-gilly. And skilly-gilly, when I'd cut up my pork or my beef, I would hopefully have a fatty piece, which was going to have some fat that I'd be able to retain into my shelter or my canteen half, and then I would take the skilly-gilly, having soaked it in water, and then put it into that bacon fat or the beef fat or the pork fat, and it would basically be like a Civil War donut. It's going to be bacon flavored, pork flavored, or beef flavored, but it's going to be very delicious actually. So, and that makes it, having soaked it in water and cooked it, makes it edible for us.
Right, and it is pretty good. Now, what about a Confederate soldier? What are some ways that you might cook your bread ration?
Well, first of all, we would have to get some water and cornmeal, and we'd have to mix it up and either use a piece of wood or stone and cook the bread. And then you would soak your meat and cook your meat and basically do the same thing as skilly-gilly in the Union, and you would put your piece of bread in the fat of the meat and soak up all the fat, and you would have basically the Confederate equivalent of skilly-gilly.
Okay. And in addition to that, some soldiers on both sides actually sometimes would cook their bread ration next to the fire, maybe on a piece of wood or a stone, something like that they could get close by, and it works surprisingly well. And so that's another option if you either don't have a frying pan or a canteen half, or maybe just don't want to use it at that point. There are other ways to cook that as well. So, is there anything else you want to add about the food? Anything that we haven't talked about?
Really, we love to get beans. Beans are once they're soaked, and they make stews really well. They give us a lot of energy, and so the hardtack beans and a little bit of meat, and you can have enough energy for the day.
Okay. Well, hopefully this has helped you get a better idea of the types of foods that both sides would eat and live off of. Usually when I have school kids here and talking to them, one of the things I ask them is what is their favorite food, so we can compare it. And usually it's pizza. This is definitely not pizza. Y'all don't even know what pizza is, but it's definitely not that. But what this food did do for them is it allowed them to continue fighting, to continue going on, and they were able to live off of this. Even if the amounts got less and less, they were able to continue living, to continue fighting and they did this for 4 years off of this type of food. So it did what it needed to do, not really what they wanted it to do to taste good, but to keep them living and surviving and moving on to the next fight.